Okay, just briefly, I've realised that I've made a small editing error. I'll try to fix that later, but we're up against it. I want to make sure that everything's posted before the lecture arrives. So I mentioned in the last objective, objective 3, that there were 3 reasons for diversification, value creation, which are the ones we're going to focus on in this section, objective 4 and 5, but also there were 2 other sets of reasons for diversification: value neutral and value decreasing. So value neutral reasons for diversification that may have a neutral effect or can even reduce revenue are: you're diversifying because of antitrust reasons. You've reached a particular size in your of growth, you can't grow anymore, or you have a certain amount of market dominance, so you don't want to expand anymore, so you look for a new opportunity. Tax laws: you buy something to get a tax advantage. You invest in an area because of tax incentives. Because you're performing poorly, so you're looking around as a manager for something that will create better performance. Uncertainty about future cash flows to reduce the risk for the firm. Maybe you're buying a supplier even though you don't think it's particularly profitable. That's sort of an insurance policy of not losing out on supply. I suppose some of the pharmaceutical and health companies wish they'd had that as an insurance policy rather than outsourcing them all their production to a single country. Now with China, but in the past when the Japanese earthquakes and tsunamis occurred, that significantly affected the production processes of some companies because they didn't have risk-reducing alternate supply chains. To gain tangible resources or to gain intangible resources. They may all have reasons to be done that increases value, but if these are just the driving reasons, that's distinct from part of a sensibly thought out diversification strategy, that was designed to gain value may not gain value. The last 2 reasons are about managerial motives. These are reasons that can reduce the value of the firm. A bigger, more complex firm increases managerial compensation and decreases employment risk. It increases managerial compensation because the firm is bigger and more complex. It decreases managerial employment risk because a more complex firm may have different areas that are more likely to perform, so you can hide the underperforming areas, or in fact, from the perspective of the manager leaving the organisation, they appear to have a broader range of experience. So that's the 2 I forgot to mention in the last section under Objective 3. Now we're going to focus on how we implement value-creating strategies. And the 2 areas of implementing value-creating strategies that I'm going to focus on are, firstly, how we do it in related diversification, and then secondly, how we do it in unrelated diversification. And as you could see by some of the examples, this is a model of related and unrelated, and sometimes it's difficult to see whether a firm is related linked or related constrained. And organisations may be quite complex and have operations that are unrelated and operations that are related. But here we go. So, Objective 4, how firms can create value by using a related diversification strategy. I've spread this out over a number of slides. It could actually be compounded into about 6 with a table, but I wanted to talk about each aspect just briefly. So don't think this is an enormous amount to know, but it is important to know, because one of the things we might ask in an exam is identify and use examples of how a firm can create value using related diversification. What value chain processes might it focus on? What operational and corporate processes might it focus on? Okay, so in related constrained and related linked diversification, you're trying to build value by using your resources and capabilities and to exploit economies of scope between the business units. So you're trying to gain value from the economies of scope between the businesses. Economies of scope are cost savings attributed to transfer of capabilities and competencies that are developed in one business into another business. It might be production technology, distribution, a marketing arm, a piece of technology that adds value, a network, locations of stores. Value is created through economies of scope, through operational relatedness and corporate relatedness. So that's the two ways we add value. Now, operational relatedness can include things like sharing activities that require strategic control over other business units. So you share activities. It's risky because the business units create links between the outcomes, and primary and support activities can be shared efficiently. So that's the benefit. So what type of activities in the value chain could we share? We could share inbound logistics, warehousing, quality assurance, inventory. We could share assembly facilities or quality control systems or maintenance in our operations. We could share a sales force or a sales desk in our outbound operations. And then we can look at other aspects of the value chain as well as examples of what we could share. Or another way to create value is through sharing core competencies. Core competencies, as we know, are based on a combination of capabilities and resources that produce core competencies that are rare, valuable, difficult to imitate, and not substitutable. So one core competency, one intangible core competency is resources, is the know-how to do something, how you do something, the system, the methodology. If you're going to transfer intangible cores, so I'll say that again, if you are going to transfer intangible resources, you need to have appropriate mechanisms to gain any advantage in economies of scope. So, while we can see ways to create operational relatedness through our primary activities, when we're transferring competencies, it's a corporate relatedness process, and we're trying to eliminate the duplication of cost, the duplication of development by spreading our corporate competencies into the organisation to gain competitive advantage. The other way to gain value, actually, I've just realised I should say one more thing. So when Wesfarmers, who have the ability to manage businesses, transfer that knowledge into that business, that's a corporate relatedness strategy. That's one of the video examples that you'll see after watching these sections. Right, the other way to gain in related constrained or related linked diversification to add value is through market power. Market power exists when you have more than one business that either reduces the cost of primary support activities or enables you to compete at multi-point levels in a broader market, so you get greater sales, greater profitability, sustainable competitive advantage, above average return, neutralise your competitors. You do that through multi-point competition and vertical integration. Multi-point competition is when you have two firms competing for the same product areas or geographical markets. Qantas and Jetstar is an example of that. Harvey Norman and Domain is an example of that. When you look at David Jones from the Woolworths South Africa group, and then you look at the companies within the Country Road group, that's multi-point competition within the same fashion area. And if you look at that boutique fashion area, Country Road and all the other companies they've got, you could see that they are competing at different segments in the market with different other small businesses. The Premier Group has the same type of process. Multi-point competition, which is Premier Group, is the Solomon Lew company that owns many boutiques. Many branded boutiques. Multi-point competition will not create potential gains when there is a successive competitive activity between the two companies. You're trying to create multi-point competition, so you're competing externally, not necessarily competing internally. One of the problems that Wesfarmers had when it owned Myer and Target, when Myer and Target were owned together and Wesfarmers, then Target and Kmart, is that they cannibalise each other's markets. So they're competing strongly with each other without actually gaining value. Vertical integration exists where you buy your supplier or you buy your distributor to enable you to compete more efficiently, and it gives you market power. Backward integration, forward integration. So that's how we gain competitive advantage. That's how we add value that enables us to get above average returns and sustainable competitive advantage through unrelated related diversification. Objective 5, this in fact should say, how do we gain it through unrelated diversification? I realise there's a typo there. I'll fix that typo later, but this is unrelated diversification. How we gain it through unrelated diversification. Unrelated diversification is the strategy when firms cannot transfer their core competencies and capabilities to different portfolios. They gain competitive advantage through financial economies. Financial economies are cost savings that arise from the top of the business. They're based in head office. It's based on the way they allocate funds and resources inside and outside the firm. Effective capital allocations and purchasing other corporations and then restructuring those assets is a typical unrelated diversified strategy. So if what firms try to do, for example, TPG, the investment private equity firm, not the internet firm, TPG tried to develop a portfolio of businesses, the different profiles that reduce the cost of the business across the total corporation. Wesfarmers sort of does the same, and they take a business and restructure it, though they do sometimes develop sub-portfolios. So Wesfarmers is one of these examples that could be unrelated diversification and can be related, linked. But if we look a little bit more broadly when we talk about corporate structure, there's actually a structure that enables you to bridge those two areas. Corporate offices in this function run the businesses from the perspective of just providing resources, and then each business almost runs independently. You don't have to share information between the different parts of the organisation. You need to adjust the managerial incentives, though, so that you're talking about strategic performance of each of the division, each of the businesses that are being run. If we look at management incentives in related diversification, management incentives in related diversification are about how you need to include how you share knowledge, how you get the whole corporation to work by sharing and cooperation, or as distinct from unrelated diversification, you can focus on the managerial incentives at business level for the performance of the subsidiary, the performance of the entity, performance of the division. Now, historically, conglomerates have a fairly short life cycle because over time they become unwieldy and complex to manage, and you can't get the advantages of the advantage of a conglomerate is that they have better ability to select businesses to be in and manage those businesses at arm's length, finance those businesses. That being said, there are a range of examples, particularly in Asia, of conglomerates that have been highly successful. And there is some type of cyclicness in the nature of this. Cyclicness, is that a word? Some type It's a cycle. So, for example, it used to be very popular in the 50s, 60s, 70s for all businesses to be conglomerate, became less popular in the 80s and 90s, early 2000s, and now we're seeing, in a way, the re-emergence of conglomerates. But through that period, we've also seen issues related to conglomerates. Now, I'm going to show you and add a video looking at Korean chaebols that are currently under pressure as conglomerates, but some of them are, but were highly successful before. And one of the reasons for saying is Samsung and Hyundai actually a conglomerate is that maybe they've moved away from being a pure conglomerate into being a related linked company, but we'll see that later. But the chaebols in Korea are an example of conglomerates, and they're an example of conglomerates that may be facing some challenges. The video example deals with that. Conglomerates in emerging economies tend to be perceived as existing because of weak financial intermediaries, weak supporting structure. So you buy your own bank, you become your own funder, as to the lack of external access to funds. Though there is some argument more recently that that's less so. Similarly, conglomerates are often limited by anti-competition regulation. In Western countries, in OECD countries, are less slow so in non-Western countries, in non-OECD countries, and differences in relationship to contract law and performance. So it's just a different evolution. I'm not 100% sure that we can consistently argue that, but as I've said, most models are simplifications of reality. So, as well as sharing financial resources, one as a way of creating a competitive advantage, creating value leading to a competitive advantage, the other way you create the advantage is through an unrelated diversification strategy is restructuring assets. Private equity firms often do this. You buy a company, say Myer, you restructure the company, Myer underperforming, restructure it, change it, sell it off to shareholders, make your profit and go away, leaving the new shareholders, as we're seeing with Myer and other department stores, to deal with the issues of underperformance. But Wesfarmers effectively did that by buying Coles, redeveloping and improving Coles, and then spinning it off as a separate company. One of the risks in this type of strategy, though, is that sometimes as I said, you're creating businesses that, because you've slashed costs and restructured, they no longer have organisational slack. They no longer can be innovative and competitive in the long term. So if you don't get rid of them, if you don't have strong managerial skills, which is the things we talked about earlier, they end up being underperforming companies that in fact return to be underperforming companies. Sometimes you create financial economies by buying a number of smaller companies, bringing them together, as has happened in the salmon farming industry in Tasmania. They've got a lot of underperforming businesses. They've been brought together into a single buying group, single selling group, single cooperative, single company. Therefore, they've got economies of scale. They don't overproduce. They rely on their differentiation strategy of being clean salmon. And then they are able to operate and export very, very efficiently, have a high-performing organisation because they've been brought all together. But then that's not really unrelated diversification. That is restructuring into one area, and they've spun off other assets out of the business. We're seeing Qantas even now, because of cost constraints, talking of jettisoning its related diversification options in overseas to become a core company. Bad example for this section. Ignore the fact I mentioned Qantas there. Okay. Now, I'm going to stop there, and then we're going to see there's some videos for you to look at. And then after that, we're going to come back to the lecture. And we're going to talk about incentives and resources that encourage diversification. which is objective 6.